But first, I just want to give a little bit of preview of what's going on so you can feel comfortable with what is ahead in the next hour. Did want to let you know that we are recording this so people can look at it afterwards. And so if you would prefer not to be recorded, I guess this would be the time to turn off your video if you've just turned it on. Um, and just want to tell you that over the next hour, it'll be we'll start with some questions for our speakers, and then you'll have time for question and answers. So as they are speaking, if there are any questions in particular you would like to have answered, feel free to put them in the chat, and I will ask those questions as we come to that section. And also just a reminder, we just welcome you from InterVarsity's our Emerging Scholars Network. That we are building a community of scholars on this journey. And so wherever you are along the way, whether a student or early career faculty, tenured faculty, wherever you are along the journey, we welcome you along with ministry partners and others. And so thank you for being here. And we will go ahead with our introduction of our speakers. And let me.
So Jamie, I think Elaine is the phone number that just got
the
added.
phone number. So got it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
thank you.
It.
Welcome.
You made Elaine. It. Hooray.
Just perfect.
Yeah.
Just perfect. We're just getting to the introduction, Elaine. So.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
We will do that, and we will deal with technical issues, as they come up here. Yeah, so let me go ahead and first of all, I want to make sure that we can highlight folks. But anyway, Denise Daniels is Hudson T. Harrison Professor of Entrepreneurship at Wheaton College. She's a management scholar with deep theological engagement in her teaching, publications, and consulting work, which focuses on leadership development and vocation in the marketplace. She co-authored the book, Working in the Presence of God, Spiritual Practices for Everyday Work. And her co-author, Elaine Howard Eckland, is the Herbert C. Audrey Chair in Social Sciences, Professor of Sociology and Director of the Bonyuk Institute at Rice University. She's best known for her sociological work on the intersection of science and religion, and has also published research on religious discrimination, religion and immigration, religion and race, and religion in the workplace. She's the author of numerous books and research articles, including Science versus Religion, What Scientists Really Think. And so we thank you, Denise and Elaine, for joining us. And I think we have Elaine on the phone and Denise on video.
It's great to be here, and I'm glad that Elaine made it. She was struggling with technical difficulties, and I don't think those got totally resolved, but at least we have a voice.
We have a voice.
Yeah. Thanks for having us. This is great.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And let's just get into the questions as we had, and we'll just see how the conversation goes, and if it leads us into other places, then some of the questions that I sent, we will go there, and about quarter till we'll start in asking some of the questions in the chat. So again, I would love to hear from both of you of what drew you to write this book at this time and to work on it together.
Well, let me start with that one, and then Elaine can jump in as well. I'm a professor in a business context, so I taught at Seattle Pacific University's business school. I'm now in a business and economics department at Wheaton College. But so I've been teaching management classes for a long time. I've been really interested in the intersection of faith and work broadly, and I've probably spent 2 decades, maybe even more now at this point, studying that intersection. And Elaine and I met, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago at this point, and became friends over the course of several years and several conferences that we engaged with. And we realized sort of towards the end of the season of meeting at conferences that was ending. We were not going to see each other again. And so, like good academics, we kind of said, why don't we do a research study together? Because then we can stay in touch. And so it's sort of the academic equivalent of a play date where we would have these scheduled engagements. We wrote grants together and started this particular set of research. And so it draws from Elaine's really deep scholarship in sociology. And most of her work had been in the area of science and faith, as you mentioned. And my interest in work and faith and how do we use these sociological methods applied in a different realm. And so working across kind of disciplinary expertise areas on something that both of us were really interested in and in a way that allowed us to be engaged with each other just as people. So that was kind of what drove it. Elaine, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so for my own work, I have studied quite a bit the attitudes that scientists have towards religion. And to a lesser extent, I've done some work in medicine as well, understanding, how doctors and people in medicine respond to faith and use faith in their work. So, from a scholarly standpoint, for me, this felt like a real extension of that previous scholarship where I could figure out if scientists and people in medicine are unique or the same from those in other occupations. So I sort of had this scholarly interest as well. And then, like Denise said, we got along so well, and a lot of success in the academy, I think, is finding folks that you really work well with and that you enjoy. And so that was a very much a non-trivial piece of us deciding to do this project. As Denise was just wanting to work together.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. I just love that idea of community and coming together in scholarship and how important that really is. And it has brought forth fruit in this work, especially. As we go into this, I would love to have you both describe your research process and what, if anything, surprised you in your findings.
Elaine, why don't you start on that one?
Yeah, sure. So we collected several types of data collection for the Faith at Work project. And then I would say we did several types of reflection as well on that data. So we did what we think is the largest survey of U.S. workers, almost 15,000 people across all occupations. We also did follow-up interviews with those who are religiously engaged as well as the non-religious, so those who were actually part of congregations or religious organizations as well as non-religious people. We did interviews with about 300, and then we did focus groups as well, where we got together people who are engaged in work and are Christians, because we wanted some of this work to have a real impact on the Christian audience. And then we also did focus groups with pastors as well. So that was our research process, and we did a lot of statistical analysis and qualitative interview analysis. For the Working for Better book, which IVP published, we also did a lot of reading of the Faith at Work literature, the existing literature, to kind of situate what we did in that broader literature. There's some fantastic books out there, reflections, theological reflections, and personal reflections on faith in the workplace. So we wanted to situate that. So I would say we did a lot of theological reflection. We have another book that's primarily for a business audience and an academic audience. It's called Religion in a Changing Workplace, and deals with folks from different types of religious traditions and none. And then it was just really fun to work together with IVP to do the Working for Better book, because we got to do a lot of reflection on how this material applies to everyday Christians in workplaces as well as pastoral audiences.
And maybe kind of unusual in a more sort of academic. This is IVP academic is the imprint. Maybe kind of unusual in an academic text. We write a lot about ourselves, and so we bring some of our own experiences to bear in this book, and some of our own reflections on what we've seen and some of the engagements that we've had with other people. So it's a much more, like, I don't know, personal reflection in some ways, and there's data, so it's a both and kind of book. And you asked about what kinds of things surprised us. from the data. And I
Yes.
guess a couple of things stood out to me. One was how few people thought of their work as a calling. So one of the things that we
Mhm.
asked in our survey, and then we also followed up in our interviews with folks, is we asked people, do you view your work as a calling? And on average, only about 1 in 5, just right around 20% of
Okay.
people said, yeah, I think of my work as a calling, which means 80% of people are not thinking of their work that way at all.
Mm-hmm.
And then we were able to kind of slice and dice and look at it in different ways. And so we looked at evangelicals in particular, and they were larger. There was a larger percentage of folks in that group that said that their work was a calling, but it was, I
Mm-hmm.
think, only 37 or 38%. So not, almost double the
Right.
baseline, but still way less than half. Right. So when you're
Mm-hmm.
looking at it, it's like, is it a good news or a bad news kind of story with respect to Christians
Yep,
thinking
that's
about their
right.
Right.
work as calling?
Mm-hmm.
So that was a little surprising, and maybe a little bit dismaying. Maybe on the plus side, we heard from a lot of people who really wanted to talk about issues of faith with other people, just as they engaged with other people as people in the workplace. So
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't like they wanted their workplaces to become religious institutions, but it was that they wanted to feel like they had the autonomy to bring their whole selves into their work in meaningful ways. And I think that's a little countercultural. I think there's a message out there that says this is one of those things that we don't talk about. And yet we talk to so many people who are like, oh, I wish I could talk about it. I wish there was more openness. I wish
Mm-hmm.
that we didn't feel so freighted with all of these kind of cultural messages about what's okay and what's not okay to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you have anything
I
to
would
add
say
to that, Elaine?
I would say for me, I was surprised to some extent, given all of the literature on faith in the workplace, the extent to which Christians felt like their churches and their pastors didn't talk as much about faith at work as they want them to. And so, this is not data collected over a long time period. So maybe they are talking about it more than they would have without all of that faith and work literature. But I think Denise and I both thought that there would be more discussions in churches, but there's still a real need to fill there, I think, for books like ours and for other kinds of materials to just help pastoral leaders and ministry leaders just think more and equip a wider variety of people about faith at work and across a variety of occupations too. I think there's some real, capacity building efforts that still need to take place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as I was reading the book, some of those things that you mentioned really struck me because I had read, a variety of faith at work books in the past, and really seeing this one as different and pointing out some unique things that, especially we in InterVarsity, as we work with graduate students and faculty and all, can engage with it and invite others into that conversation. And kind of going there right now is wanting to ask about that, those on this scholar's journey, the people on this webinar and now and who will be listening to it, many of them are on that journey. And it's easy to see our work as secular
Mm.
in the workplace. And you were saying that a lot of people don't see their
Yeah.
work as calling. And I just wondering how you see that related, particularly in the academic world. And yeah, we'll just start with that question. How,
Well, let
yeah.
me start. Yeah, let me start answering that by kind of talking about, on the one hand, we had a lot of people who said, my work is not a calling. But then when we were talking to people, when we had these interviews and gave them a little bit more freedom to talk about what their experiences were at work, we had quite a range of the ways that people actually talked about their work as a calling. So,
Okay.
and this was the conversations that we had were not representative sample of the US population. So the survey was a representative sample.
Mm-hmm.
We talked to mostly Christians. So we had a higher percentage of the folks that we were talking to who were more likely to say that their work was a calling. And in those
Mm-hmm.
conversations, we ended up hearing from people a couple of ways in which people thought about their work as a calling. And we ended up dividing these into kind of categories, or we had a couple dimensions that we ended up seeing that they emerged from this data. So on the one hand, people would either talk about their work as a calling in terms of it the work being intrinsically meaningful. There was something about the work that they were doing that felt like they were contributing to other people in a meaningful way. And then on the other hand, we also had some people talking about their work as extrinsically meaningful. In other words, they would not really talk about their work, what they were doing on a daily basis, but they would talk about the ways that their work allowed them to give to gain entree into people's lives in a meaningful way, or it allowed them to provide for their families or provide for missions organizations or something like that. So the work per se wasn't the locus of meaning, but it was the extrinsic ways that their work allowed them to experience meaning in some other way. So we had this intrinsic and extrinsic dimension.
Okay.
And then we found also that people talked about their work in terms of meaning, in terms of who they served and whether that service was close to or inside of the workplace versus beyond the workplace. And so you can imagine these as two different dimensions. And of course, because we're good academics, we put them into we're good social scientists, we put them into a 2x2 framework. And so now you've got 4 quadrants that you can kind of picture,
Right.
intrinsic close to the workplace, intrinsic beyond the workplace, extrinsic close, and extrinsic far. And we found examples of people kind of talking about their work as calling in each of those domains. So your question is, what about academics? How do we think of our work as
Yeah.
calling? And I think generally speaking, we tend to think of our work as intrinsically meaningful. That is, what it is that we're focused on is somehow meaningful to God, to maybe to our own selves, because we're using our skills and talents in a particular way, or maybe it has meaningful implications for the world in some good and productive ways. And yet there are also times where we're like, is it really meaningful? Like, am I really having an impact on anyone? Am I really touching the students in any meaningful way? And so I think at that point, it might be helpful to start thinking about our work as extrinsically meaningful. So what are the ways in which this particular job that I'm in right now, God has opened up doors for me to engage with people. God has opened up opportunities for me to serve others. Maybe it's not because of the content of what I study or teach or something else, but maybe it's because of the opportunities that I have to engage. And so one of the takeaways, I think, for us from this research was that calling can be, and maybe should be, very, very broad. And if we are not experiencing calling in one particular dimension or domain, what are some other areas that we can start kind of really intentionally trying to understand our work as calling? Elaine, you want to add
One
anything to
thing,
that?
yeah. Oh,
Sure.
that was great, Denise. One thing that I felt like I learned is that, calling does not necessarily proceed for people in a completely linear way. So I think I had thought, okay, you get this call from God and then you go into this particular kind of occupation. But I think I learned from our respondents that calling is sometimes realized that you are in a particular job or occupation. Maybe you didn't feel particularly called at the outset, but then as you are there over time, there are ways in which you can feel called and you start to feel called, and then maybe the occupation itself starts to feel like a calling. And I think, when we broaden out the ways in which people can feel called, I think that's just really important to give people those kinds of options and to try to perhaps demystify calling a bit for people.
Yeah. And I want to, let me also kind of address, I see the questions that Catherine
great.
put in the chat
Please.
there. So let me respond to a couple of those. We did see differences across different kinds of groups in terms of the likelihood of somebody experiencing calling. So we did see this, we saw differences between men and women, particularly we saw women were about twice as likely as men to say that their work was a calling. So men much less likely to experience their work as a calling. We also saw differences in terms of level in an organization. So those at the top of their organizations were much more likely to say that their work was experienced as a calling. Those who were at the bottom of their organizations, and so you can think of entry-level kinds of work, less likely to think of their work as a calling. And then we did see sort of industry industry differences or the kinds of jobs that people had. So jobs that were focused on people or serving people in some way, people talked about as a calling. Jobs that had less people engagement or interaction were less likely to be perceived as a calling. So it wasn't so much of choice about job versus lack of choice about job, which is kind of the way that Catherine framed the question. But there were certainly differences in terms of how people engaged or thought about their work as a calling, depending on the kinds of roles that they were in. So.
Excellent. Thank you for that. I mean, I think that idea of, and look at, we have
Elaine is
Elaine.
here in person.
We can see her there. But no, I appreciate your unpacking this idea of calling, because it can be, as I've talked to faculty and students, and even in my own life, it can be this huge thing. It's like, oh, we have to have this immense calling and understand it, and you know,
It can
and
almost
do
be
something great
crippling
for
for
God.
people.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really can be.
And I'll say one other thing about calling, and this also attends to kind of the question that Catherine was getting at. And what we've kind of a counterintuitive finding perhaps is that people who made more money had a lower experience of calling. People who made less money had a higher experience of calling. And so there are some socioeconomic implications of this, but it's not the direction that you would expect. And then the last thing I'll say is that that's also kind of counterintuitive to what I just said a minute ago about people at the top of their organizations more likely to experience calling. And so we looked at this for a long time, and we're like, wait a minute, how is it that people at the top of their organizations are more likely to experience calling, and people who make less money are also more likely to experience their work as a calling? And we ultimately concluded that it had something to do with the types of organizations that people were working with. In other words, where can you imagine people at the top of their organizations not making very much money? And it's typically nonprofit world. And that's where people are saying, oh, that's where I'm experiencing a sense of calling. So there's some really interesting sort of maybe data artifacts that we were puzzling over in this research.
Wonderful. Well, thank you about that kind of, again, unpacking what calling can really mean.
Yeah.
I'd like to go on to the next question here, which I think addresses one of the questions in the chat here. Would you unpack the statement from your book on page 79? Part of being a faithful Christian at work is your awareness of and concern for those who are not Christians. What might this look like as a scholar or faculty member?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we talk a lot in the book about recognizing that others are made in the image of God, that we are all made in the image of God. And so then this means that every person we interact with has the possibility of teaching us something, has some kind of God image going on that we can learn from, and that we have perhaps responsibilities to care for others as well. So there is a sense where, just a couple of practical things, I think it can be quite disarming. And for those of us who want to share our faith, a really effective way to share our faith, if we fight for the rights of others who are being marginalized. So I think in particular about religious minorities in the academy. I've done a lot of work trying to understand religion in academic life broadly. And when Christians get sort of fired up about the kind of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia that sometimes happens on campus and are attentive to that, I think that actually has a pretty powerful witness for the Christian, for the gospel as well. And so that's something I've known to be very effective. And then just trying to figure out what we can learn from others. So having a kind of genuine intellectual humility rather than, when you're kind of listening so that you can say something else, versus really listening and trying to figure out, what others might have to teach us. So I think at least in academic work, those two kinds of things can be extremely effective. Because I'm sure, as the questioner knows, there are just incredible stereotypes about Christians in some kinds of academic organizations. And those two practices that I just mentioned can undercut some of those stereotypes, I think.
Yeah, I think I would add to that we really do focus on this Imago Dei notion, as Elaine mentioned, but that leads us to in the later chapters in the book, talking about the idea of principled pluralism. We live in and we work in pluralistic contexts where there are people from a variety of faith traditions and no faith traditions. And what does it look like to really recognize the dignity of others and the image of God in others who come from very different cultural contexts and very different religious contexts? And so we frame it as this idea of principled pluralism, which means not at all letting go of who you are. In other words, this is not saying all religions are kind of equally valid and all the same, and we just need to get along. That's not what principled pluralism is. Principled pluralism says, I'm a Christian, and as a Christian, I believe certain things, including the idea that everyone is made in God's image and valuable in God's economy. And so help me understand what you believe. Help me understand your perspective. And so it takes a listening stance. It's not a listening stance so that, again, to create a common denominator, lowest common denominator across all religions, it's creating a listening stance so that we really can respect others who are different. And so listening carefully, not being firm on our own beliefs and our own kind of orientation, and also trying to understand another's and trying to respect them in their beliefs and trying to support what we can in terms of the ways that they are practicing their own religious identity. And I think this is tricky for a lot of Christians because we think, well, if I'm supporting somebody else, if I'm going to advocate for the Muslim who needs, space to pray during the day, am I really just affirming that Islam is the right religion? And I don't think the answer to that is yes. I think it's no. In fact, you're not saying that at all. But what you are saying is that this person is worthy of respect, and the way that they want to worship God, the way that they understand how they should be worshiping God, they should be allowed to engage in appropriate ways in the workplace.
Well, thank you for that. As you're saying, some of these are hard ways, are difficult ways, but as you say, they are disarming and can serve to not alienate Christians from others as we seek to live out our faith in the workplace, especially on campuses today. Well, one of the things that
Jamie, before you move on, let me just say one other thing on this, because I think the most common thing in the academy is probably people who do not identify as having a faith tradition. So they are the nuns,
that's true.
right? The people who are agnostic or atheist or something else. And it's a little hard to engage there in terms of, well, tell me about what you believe. Well, I don't believe anything. I believe in a materialistic worldview. And the conversation kind of stops potentially there. But I also think that oftentimes in our culture today, many of those people do come from religious traditions of some kind that they have rejected at some point. And that rejection is very often not an intellectual rejection. It is an experiential rejection. There's something about their experience that has been painful, that has been harmful, that has been demeaning. And I wonder if we are open to having those conversations and listening well to the hurts that other people bring to the table, if there might be, again, more opportunity for positive engagement across people. Elaine, you are muted.
Elaine. Don't know.
We don't know how to unmute you. If you look at the top right of your screen.
Here we go.
Thank
you. I was going to confirm what Denise is saying in particular related to the scientific community, which I've been studying about 20 years. And you would think that the scientific community in the academy might be the community that is most apt to reject Christian faith because of intellectual reasons. But we find in our research that that is definitely not the case, that Denise is right. Even in the science community, the modal reason for rejecting faith, the Christian faith in particular, is some kind of bad experience as a child or, over the course of their lives before they entered science.
Yeah. And so all that just really points to having open, curious conversations.
Yeah.
Right. That see the other person as the image of God that they are.
Which hopefully, again, academics are curious people. So hopefully those are good conversations that we can have.
Right. Very rich conversations.
Yeah.
And I would imagine that some people are even yearning to have those conversations.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I would like to ask about this idea of rest. So throughout the book, in almost every chapter, the idea and invitation to rest in our work comes up.
Mhm.
And you point people to the need for rest and for a healthy work rhythm.
Mhm.
Um, why is that such a central idea in your work? And in my experience of the Academy, it's not known for inviting people to rest, even though, one of the practices is sabbatical. And that is about rest, but it usually is not restful. Sabbatical, academic sabbaticals aren't. And so why is that a central idea of your work? And what advice would you give to people about structuring their academic vocations around rest? And what has been your
Well,
experience?
yeah,
Well,
I
I'll,
think the first, oh, go ahead, Elaine.
I was just going to say a couple things, maybe you can jump in, Denise. I what's coming to mind immediately, and I think the reason that we so emphasize rest throughout the book and then devoted a single chapter to it is because all of this talk about faith and work integration can, very easily, if it's not put in a proper place, become a way of almost prioritizing one's work over other kinds of
Mm,
callings, and then even to the point of worshiping one's work. So,
Mhm.
I do think that if we don't have a sense of our own limitations, that we quickly get into that place that it undercuts our theology of work, actually, that, we try to have a sense that we can, you know, sort of outpace our limitations or do more than we should as humans who are made in the image of God, but are not actually God. And so I think
mhm.
that kind of underlying theological framework is really important. But Denise, maybe we can talk about, and I can later, some of the practices that have found really helpful.
Yeah, I
Mhm.
would just say that, you asked about why we focused on this,
Yeah.
and I think the short answer is because we're really bad at it. Um, and so there's a little bit of saying something to ourselves and not just a book audience. You commented on that I'd written another book, Working in the Presence of God, which came out a
Mhm.
few years ago, and the last chapter in that book is also about Sabbath. So you'll see a theme here, like
Okay.
the last chapters in these books are focused on something that, so I think there's a little bit of an autobiographical
Mhm.
component to our research is my point here. And we have, I personally have struggled with rest. And this is actually how I even came to the faith work conversation, probably back in 1998. So almost
Mm,
30 years ago now. I had just had my second child and I was working as a relatively new faculty member and I was exhausted and trying to figure out, well, how does my faith have something to say about my
mhm.
work? And isn't there something about, Sabbath? What do I do? Like, how do I do that? And and so I started, like a good academic, researching it and started looking at the ways that people engage in Sabbath. Um, to Elaine's point, we talk so much about work in this book and the value and importance of it, but it can become an idol when you center it so much. And so the antidote to
Mm,
that is intentionally setting it aside in a very intentional and rhythmic way and saying, I am not going to engage in it. It is not going to fill every corner of my life. There are some spaces that it doesn't have purchase. And so, I do very intentionally not work on Sundays, and have now for the past couple of decades, which was a very scary practice when I started it because I thought I am just not going to be ready on Monday. Like I'm going to be a mess. And it's been kind of surprising to me, but almost to the point of like funny that nobody has found me out yet. Like I haven't. I've managed to make it every Monday morning, and nobody's like, "Oh, I can tell you did not put in the work yesterday."
mm,
Um, so it has been okay. Like I keep finding that God meets me in those moments of even when I'm maybe not feeling as fully prepared as I wish that I were. But there's this saying that if show me somebody who can't get all their work done in 6 days a week, and I'll show you someone who can't get their work done in 7. And there's truth to that. Like our work can expand whatever space we give it. And so to intentionally put some boundaries around it is something that we feel like is really important, both as
Yeah.
Christians, but also just as human beings.
mhm.
We talk quite a bit too in that particular chapter about different kinds of rest practices. So I think for some people, starting out with a day of not working per week maybe is too much, or just not, it's too much for
Mm,
them to start out with. And if we are working insanely 6 days. Even if we take off one day, it's maybe not enough, right? It's sort of like done in a rule-based way, in a way that's actually not fulfilling the purpose or meaning of the Sabbath. So we talk about, what does it mean to think of daily practices, and what do hourly practices even look like? How can we reset ourselves through attention to God in between meetings? And what might it look like to have even a yearly retreat? So going in the other direction. So I think there's a lot that can be done. And just a lot more that we can do as academics. And it's quite a powerful witness, I think, when we are not kind of wearing our busyness as a badge of courage, which is so incredibly common in academia. I've never heard any academic that I've interacted with, from undergraduate to, the most seasoned professor, say, I'm just not that busy right now.
Yeah, I'm really
So,
relaxed and
I mean,
yeah,
I'm just not that
flexible.
busy right now. And so I have time, just come hang out in my office. So there's a way in which we are, I think, uh, having a kind of particular witness to, where people will start to ask us, like, how are you able to keep that up? Like, what's behind all of that?
I would add one other thing here, which is that a lot of us as faculty, or if we are in a faculty role, we have power over other people and their schedules in some ways that we may recognize and may not. But if we have students who are directly working for us, particularly graduate students who are trying to please us, how do we make sure that they are able to engage in rhythmic lives of work and rest? If we have undergraduate students, again, what kinds of structures are we putting in place to ensure, or at least allow for the possibility that they are not having to always be working all the time? So I think we need to be thinking not just about our own selves, but also about others, and how we are structuring the schedules for the people who work for us, or the people that we have some measure of control over.
Yeah. Yeah. Even as you're, um, yeah, providing these questions for us to think about in our life, there are many ideas running through my head of some possibilities, and how to ask these questions of students and faculty and all. Anything else you want to share about this idea of rest before we go to the last question? And as we're doing this, I'll invite people to continue to put questions in the chat that you would like Denise and Elaine to respond to. But anything else about rest before I go on to the last question I have?
The thing that's been most helpful to me is, I used to, whenever I had a few minutes, I would quickly do a few emails or somehow check in. And I've started to think about, actually, a few minutes between meetings or between tasks as maybe a time when I could, check out rather than check in. And so what does it mean to, it's going to just look different for every person. So you might say a prayer, you might pray over your next meeting, you might lie down, or just sit quietly. So I think those little things can then become much larger ingrained ways of acting and being. So I would just encourage the listeners to start with something small that seems doable, and then see where it leads.
That's great.
Yeah, thank you. Sometimes it's that creativity of thinking about our days in new ways and how we are using the time that we have. So I want to close out this time of questioning before we get to additional questions from the group. Is, where do you see signs of hope in people and organizations working for better? So through the conversations that you've had, through your research, through just experiences, where do you see some of this taking place already?
Yeah, I would say that a lot of our conversations were really encouraging. There was a sense kind of coming away from them of, wow, these people are really thinking about something in a ways that I hadn't thought about it before. And it was just a very kind of positive engagement or a sense of, wow, these folks really are thinking about their faith in meaningful ways in the workplace and wanting to engage with others in meaningful ways in the workplace. So I think that was largely positive.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't see so much organizational examples, Jamie, and I think the reason
Mm.
for that is because we weren't looking at the organizational
Got it.
level. We really were
Mm-hmm.
looking at the individual level, and
Right.
that's where our surveys and interviews were taking place. So
Mm-hmm.
even in the course of our interviews, like we wouldn't identify the name of the organization
Got
that
it.
somebody would be working
Mm-hmm.
in,
Mm-hmm.
just as a
That
way to
makes
keep,
sense.
yeah. Um, but I do think this broadly, I was encouraged by the breadth of and the different kinds of ways that people were engaging. Elaine, do you have any specifics? I'm trying to think of some specifics as I'm saying that.
Yeah, there are two examples come to mind. So even as we said that we would expect churches to be talking more about faith at work than they are, there were some really lovely examples of pastoral leaders and churches that our respondents referred to who are doing a lot. So we interviewed a pastor in a focus group who felt like one of his congregants was being discriminated against in the workplace, and this pastor had a law background and ended up actually going into the workplace and facilitating some discussions. And so it was like kind of crazy. It wasn't just
Mm-hmm.
that a congregant was learning about faith and work in the workplace, taking that in. It's like the pastor, in this case, a man, going in and sort of integrating faith at work as well. And then I also remember that we interviewed someone who was a cleaner at a hospital and who I think when we interviewed her, we felt like, oh my gosh, that's such menial work. Surely she won't see that particular work as a calling. I would say that was my modal stereotype. And she very much saw her work as a calling because, she said that she got the space ready, and free of germs for others to do their work, and that she made it a sacred space for others to come in behind her. And that just really challenged me. It's sort of whenever I've given that example now a couple of times, and it kind of brings tingles to me when I give it because it sort of changed me. And I had a very difficult week last week. I have a relative who I'm very close to passed away,
Mm-hmm.
and I was had the privilege of being in the ICU a couple of days with her. And there was a cleaner who came in several times a day, was assigned to our ICU room and cleaned. And I just felt really compelled to tell her, my daughter's like, you didn't tell this stranger that you wrote a book about faith at work, did you? And I totally did. I like approached the person and I just said, I've written this book about faith at work. And I said, the most impacting interview that we did for the whole project was with someone who's in your same occupation. And I said, and here's what she said. And I said, I wonder if that resonates with you. And she just said, so few people recognize the importance of what I'm doing. And,
Mm-hmm.
thank you for that. So it was a very powerful experience.
Yeah, I was thinking about we interviewed one guy who worked at a fruit packing plant in the southeast
Yep.
part of the United States. And he was a faithful Christian, but he didn't really talk about fruit packing at all. I mean, I think he could have said, my job allows other people to eat fresh fruit around the country or something, but he didn't. He didn't say anything like that. He said, my job, I really feel like it's a calling. I really feel like God has me here because the other people here at the fruit packing plant, they call me Yoda. And they call me that because they come to me with their problems and they want me to help them think through how to solve them. And he goes, so I've got this one guy I've been talking to for the last 4 weeks, and he's really struggling with his wife. And I feel like I have this opportunity to speak into his life and help him heal his marriage. And so here is this guy who, again, if you think about calling in those different dimensions, it's very extrinsic.
Mm-hmm.
The way he's thinking about his job is very extrinsic, but very close to the workplace because it's the people that he's working with that he's impacting in this really meaningful way.
Mm-hmm.
And so there were these range of ways that people would engage and talk about how their faith mattered. John, I see your question too about
Mm-hmm.
finding meaning in jobs that aren't people facing per se. So I think a couple of those examples that Elaine and I have talked about could be that. But I think what you're also getting at is like, how do I get people to feel like their work is intrinsically meaningful? Um, and I think part of that is just a reframe. It's thinking slightly differently about the value that you bring to your work or the value that you can contribute in your work. And I'll give you an example from my own life. I was, and this example actually makes it to the book, but when I was in labor with my fourth child, I was actually induced. So I was most of the day like really not in labor. And so I was kind of chatting up with my nurse. And my nurse was a lovely Christian lady, and she herself had had a bunch of kids. And anyway, she was telling me at one point about a friend of hers who had become a dental, I was studying to become a dental hygienist. And she's like, can you imagine, like, what a gross job, like having your hands in people's mouths all day? And I started to laugh out loud because I'm like, you are a labor and delivery nurse. and and if there's anything grosser than putting your hands in people's mouths all day, it might be what you do. And she starts to laugh and she goes, no, but that's not what I do is I welcome new people into the world. And I'm like, of course that's what you do. But and that's lovely. And that's a total way of reframing what you're doing. But maybe the dental hygienist is not just sticking our hands in people's mouths all day. Maybe she's relieving pain and maybe she's making sure that they're healthy and all these kinds of other things. So part of it is a reframing. Part of it is thinking through what is this task that I'm doing and how can I consider it? How can I think about it beyond just the mechanics of it? What are the ways that I'm potentially impacting others, even if it's not a direct impact on people? You know, maybe I'm not working with people, maybe I'm making something, but what is the impact on the next person down the conveyor belt? Or what's my impact on the person who might be purchasing that good? What is the impact in my life and in their lives?
Mm-hmm.
The
Yeah.
thing that's coming to mind for me is that, we found over and over that people say that if they're doing relational work, they're much more likely to see that as a calling and to see it as having spiritual value. And I think that we haven't done a good enough job in our churches and in our fellowship and ministry groups of thinking about how, changing systems or making processes better or making sure money is spent wisely are deeply spiritual acts and have the capacity to be deeply spiritual acts as well. Denise and I interviewed a fellow who worked in at the back end of a hospital in finance, and he said, "Oh my gosh, I totally see how doctors and nurses could see their work as a spiritual calling, but I'm mainly in records and billing and finance, and that in the hospital, and that's totally not a spiritual calling at all." Well, anyone who has been, in the medical system, which all of us have been, knows that if records are not kept well, if billing is not done accurately, it just messes everything up and can just take away needless hours of time trying to rectify it. And so making sure those systems are excellent and that the systems themselves care for people well, I think could be reframed as a deeply spiritual act. And the other kind of thing is, to think about this from a leadership standpoint. Some jobs are harder than they need to be. And some jobs are as a result of unjust systems. And so when we are leaders, how can we think about our capacity to relieve those injustices, make those systems fairer, give people better vacations, raise people's wages under certain conditions? What is our agency as leaders to make our particular small world of work or our work organizations better? And how might we creatively do that such that work is better for everyone?
Mm. Yeah, those are great ways to think about reframing and seeing all the intrinsic and the extrinsic callings that God is inviting us into. So we have a couple of minutes left. Are there any burning questions out there?
And you don't have to type
that
them, you
people-
can just ask them.
You just
Yeah,
say them.
unmute yourself and ask. Feel free to do that. You have explained everything so well, but not enough that people don't need to go out and purchase the book, right? Purchase it and share it with others. Um,
And review
that,
it wherever you buy books.
yes.
Please rate and review it. I hate that we always have to ask that, but we do because it really does make a difference.
And I will actually go ahead and put in the chat. You'll see that for those who are interested, everybody should be interested in purchasing the book now if you haven't already. But InterVarsity Press is offering 25% off through the end of November if you use the code IVP ESN25. So you can go to ivpress.com and get that discount. There, you'll also see, along with that invitation, to purchase the book, and please read it, share it with others, and review it, that if anyone is interested and familiar, hopefully everybody is familiar with Urbana, InterVarsity's Triennial Missions Conference, but it is happening again this year in Phoenix. And faculty and grad students will have spaces once again to gather and to engage with this. And so if you're interested, there is a special link here that you can register specifically if you are a faculty member or graduate student, so that we can know that you're coming and you can be part of the community of scholars that will be there at Urbana. So that's my few advertisements there at the end. But before we close out, is there anything final you would like to see, Denise or Elaine, about the book or about working for better faith at work? Yeah.
I will say one other thing, just because we didn't touch on it at all in our conversation in the last hour, and that is we have a couple of chapters on the ways that churches engage with women who work, and the ways that women's experiences particularly are different from men, and particularly so in Christian contexts. And so we have a lot of data from that. We have some suggestions for ways that both organizations and churches can maybe engage a little differently to serve both men and women more effectively who work.
And I would say one downside and upside. So we didn't talk very much about the potential downsides of feeling called to one's work. So we do talk in the book quite a bit about, the possibility that people who feel called are also not likely to, ask for raises. They're not likely to try to complain about their workplaces. They tend to look the other way when they experience discrimination. So it's as if feeling called to one's work can, under certain conditions, lead to a kind of, I should suck it up if the workplace is not just kind of framing. And for leaders, if you work, say, in nonprofit or in very people-oriented work, you kind of feel like your employees should put in the extra hours, maybe uncompensated. And so just to think about that kind of thing as well. And then something very positive and hopeful is that I think both of us would say that writing this book together really changed us as well and how we approach work. And I think broaden our range of thinking of our work as a calling and approaching work in a more just and hopeful way. And that's a great privilege, publishing with InterVarsity Press and getting the chance to do that kind of theological reflection. It, for us, was a spiritual formation project as well. So, and if there are folks out there who want us to come and speak to their campuses or that kind of thing, I think we're open to considering some of that as well. So just wanted to put in a plug there too. So hope to see some of you maybe in person.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Denise and Elaine, for taking the time to share with us, and more importantly, taking the time to write this book and getting it out there so we can engage with it and on many different levels here. And thank you, everyone who spent this past hour in conversation or in listening to us. So thank you for the engagement. And in the coming months, there's a few other things that the Emerging Scholars Network and faculty ministry within InterVarsity will be doing, and that will be coming out in Campus Calling and in Scholars Journey in the next couple of weeks. So look out for that to participate in different ways. But all in all, just thank you and blessings as we head out to work for better in the coming hours and weeks.
Thanks, Jamie, and thanks everyone else.
Yeah, this was a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye now.